Hello, hi everyone. My name is Munira Rajkotwalla. I'm a senior reporter for Mining Magazine, and I'm joined today by Peter Handley, Deputy to the Director, Head of Unit at DG Grow at the European Commission. Peter currently heads the team on energy-intensive industries, raw materials, and hydrogen at the European Commission's Directorate-General for Internal Market, Industry, Entrepreneurship and SMEs. So we're going to be talking today about the European Commission's outlook on critical minerals and raw materials. We're also going to be talking about the broader landscape, including challenges and risks to the mineral supply chain and opportunities going forward. So it's lovely to have you here, Peter. Thank you so much for joining me. Let's start off with hearing a bit about the Commission's outlook on critical minerals. Lots has happened recently, particularly with the Critical Raw Minerals Act, as I can see in your background. So could you tell me a bit about the Act and the significance of it in ensuring the availability for minerals in European industries?
Yes, thanks very much, Munira, and happy you start off with the Critical Raw Materials Act. This is actually quite a big deal. It's the first time that the European Union has introduced legislation which is applicable across Europe around securing the supply of raw materials. Where we are is we're now waiting for the final procedural steps so that this act can be published in the official journal and enter into force. And we think it'll enter into force sometime early May. This is actually pretty fast going for European legislation. It normally takes 2 or 3 years from the time the Commission proposes some legislation, but we managed to actually go from our proposal 16th of March 2023 to getting a political agreement already by the 13th of November last year, so less than 9 months. And since then, it's just the regular process of cleaning up the text and getting it translated into different languages and things. But all the main parameters of the deal are in place, and we're looking forward to its entry into force.
Great. I'm curious to hear about, you said the main parameters of the deal. What are the objectives of this act, and why is it so important at this stage?
So, why is it important? I'll start with that one. It's important because we can see some very worrying signs that the European economy cannot be sure it's going to get the raw materials that it needs for its general economic purposes, but also in relation to all these different technological and policy objectives we've set ourselves. We're parties to the Paris Climate Agreement. We've set in law Europe's ambition to be climate neutral by 2050. We've got a whole raft of energy and climate legislation to make that possible. But all of these things actually require replacing a fossil fuel economy with one which is based on clean energy and clean technologies, all of which are much more metals and minerals intensive than the system that they replace. And that's just for the green transition. We've got the digital transition as well, things like AI, quantum computing, lots of big data issues. And everyone thinks that the whole economy of the world is now virtual and detached from material facts, but it's absolutely not true. All of these things are based on data centers, wiring, electronic equipment. It's very materials based. And let's not also forget, finally, we have security, we have defense, we have aerospace. These are sectors of also strategic importance, which are very materials intensive. So that's all the why. And the what is we want to improve our understanding of what's really going on in the global markets and the European markets for these metals and minerals. So this leads you into identification of what's going on in the markets, stress testing, risk assessment, leads you into things like how you can incentivize investments in good projects in Europe, outside Europe. And when I say projects, I'm not just talking about mining, I'm talking a full value chain approach. And it's also very much about sustainability, resource efficiency, seeing how we can dampen demand and still achieve our policy objectives. This is an equal amount of weight to the security of supply, because there's no point just rushing for gold, if you like, if you don't take account of the impact we're having on the planet. So I think that's the key thing. We have to balance security of supply with sustainability.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And you know, this, what you alluded to, security of supply, that's something that's been a big conversation, you know, at the moment in the industry, and particularly looking at supply chains and value chains across the board. So I want to ask you, what do you think are the main risks to the supply chain, particularly for, you know, battery metals and critical minerals, and for Europe in the coming, you know, years?
There's a whole series of risks. If you want to zoom in on the battery value chain, you have to start from the end point, which is, let's say, for example, on electric cars. If you want to be able to produce electric cars here in Europe, they need to have the battery gigafactories. They need to have the ability to make the cathode materials, to make the anode materials. And all of that presupposes you know where you're going to get your raw materials from. So the essence of the battery value chain is understanding that vertical integration requirement to make it all happen. Mm-hmm. Then you have to ask the question, do we care where the stuff comes from, geographically mm-hmm. speaking, and who makes it? And here choices have in fact been made, because the European Union has said it wishes to be one of the leading markets in the world for producing batteries, for producing electric vehicles. So yeah, the kind of risks we face, therefore, are where do we secure the supplies from, domestically and from outside the European Union, and then making sure that European businesses are alert to the opportunities and ready to invest and engage in the kind of projects which can offer good environmental, social, and governance performance standards.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Now, when it comes to, you know, where the minerals come from, one big talking point has been China, because China does do a lot of the extraction and processing. What are your views on diversifying away from China?
Well, our Critical Raw Materials Act is all about diversification, but it's not diversification from China. It's not an anti-China piece of legislation. It's a pro-Europe, pro-resilient economy piece of legislation. And what we're actually wanting to achieve is do more with the resources we have in Europe. That's one form of diversification. And the other is spread our external sourcing where we can, so that we're not like almost 100% dependent on a single country for a particular material, because that's just an excessive amount of risk. And we want to reduce these strategic dependencies, and spreading the supply is the best way to achieve that. We have very high levels of dependency on a number of countries. Sometimes it's China, sometimes it's not. It can be Turkey, it can be Brazil, it can be the United States, it can be South Africa or the Democratic Republic of Congo. But in all these cases, the key message is diversify, engage European industry, engage European banks and financial institutions, provide a political de-risking framework, and be there for the long haul.
Mm-hmm. And what is your outlook on extracting within Europe? Do you think that there should be more mining done locally as well?
That is an important piece of the puzzle, and that's why one of the benchmarks we've set in the regulation is to raise the level of domestic extraction of metals and minerals to at least 10% of our 2030 consumption requirements. Mm-hmm. And in some cases, it's very, very low today, 1 or 2%, if at all. So yes, there is a drive where we have the resources already identified in the European Union, where we've got projects already at some stage in development, to take a close look at those projects and see whether we can get them off the ground, where we can engage meaningfully with the local communities, with the different levels of government, where the permitting can be done in a good, predictable and integrated way, and where the financing is there and where the market is there for these materials. So yes, we do expect to see a return to some degree of what we always used to do in the past, and have forgotten a little bit how to do. But let's not get the impression that there's no mining in Europe. There is quite a bit already, particularly in regions in the north of Europe. And I think we can see going down over the next few years that there should be a build-up of what we're doing in this space inside the European Union.
Yeah. Well, I think one of the things that's developed in the past couple of decades is a greater environmental consciousness within Europe, which I think lends itself to sometimes more of an anti-mining sentiment. So how do you think these two things need to be balanced? How do we extract resources while also making sure that we're sustainable and doing the right thing for the planet, for the countries involved?
Well, I think the first thing is we think that we are probably better able to do things in a sustainable and responsible manner inside the European Union because we set the ground rules for operation. You know, we have quite a lot of legislation, and now, of course, we have the Critical Raw Materials Act coming along. We already have the batteries regulation. We have environmental impact assessment legislation. We have a whole raft of things which mean we can control the framework conditions much more easily than if it's taking place in a developing country with non-European operators. So that's the first thing. And the second thing is that what we're putting in place with the Critical Raw Materials Act are very clear expectations on how projects will be done in future. We will expect project promoters to show that they're engaging responsibly with local communities, with indigenous peoples, wherever that may apply, that they come forward with good information about the project and how they intend to go about it, how they intend to leave the site when they've finished active operations, and so on and so forth. So I think we're fairly confident that we're setting the right conditions for doing more mining, but also refining and recycling here in Europe in ways which we hope the public will understand and be involved in discussing with us.
Great, you've leaded on very nicely to my next question, which was about the circular economy. So as you said, you know, recycling is becoming more and more of an issue. What are your thoughts on creating a circular economy in Europe?
Well, actually, I was involved in my last job in the Secretariat-General developing the first circular economy action plan. So I do take this very seriously, and I'm a very strong believer in really looking at how we use things in the European economy. We do think that the recovery and recycling form an important part of a circularity approach, but they're a little bit end of the pipeline. We need to actually start off by designing things in the right way. Design for sustainability, design for repairability, design for recovery and recycling. And that includes things like making sure that bits and pieces that go into products are clearly labeled, QR codes or whatever it might be, or accompanied by product passports, which allow you to know exactly what you're dealing with. That makes it much easier to do this. And this is something that we're intending to do for batteries. It's something that we've put in our Critical Raw Materials Act for permanent magnets, which are in wind turbines and in electric vehicles and lots of other things as well. So that's one aspect that we're dealing with on the circularity front. The other is that we're asking all the member states to take a look at the potential we have for recovering critical raw materials from the economy and come up with national circularity plans. That, I think, will help a lot. And one of the things that came out of the negotiating process on our Critical Raw Materials Act was a very strong push for more ambition on the recycling benchmark for 2030. We actually proposed at least 15% of our 2030 consumption needs should come from the recycled materials, and it's now 25%. That's already ambitious, but there's an extra level of ambition on top of that because we have to analyze specific product streams where there is dedicated sectorial waste legislation and where we can really be very, very quantifiably targeting the recovery potential for things. So we already have legislation in place for batteries. We've got legislation proposed earlier this year on the end of life for cars. And down the road, we may do the same thing for other waste product streams, such as wind turbines.
Yeah. And it seems like the Act is setting out some very ambitious targets across the board, whether that be recycling, extraction, and processing. What do you anticipate the main challenges to enforcing the Act being?
Well, the main challenges are common to every piece of European regulation, which is that the member states now have an obligation to put things in place to be ready to implement the various functions. So do we at the European level. There's a whole raft of tasks which now fall on us to develop. But other actors also have to do things. We're expecting the financial institutions, we're expecting industries which are producing clean or digital technologies or in the defense and aerospace fields to really get down and look at their supply chain risks and come up with action plans to reduce their security of supply exposure. So everyone's got to do something, and we're going to hopefully start in May this year with the first actions once we bring the Critical Raw Materials Act into force. With all pieces of legislation which involve things coming into the European Union, you need to be able to rely on the customs authorities. You need to be able to rely on market surveillance authorities to ensure that the European rules are being respected.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great. All right, looking forward, I want to talk about some of the new opportunities that we see in terms of the critical minerals supply chain. And one of the things that's happened recently is Norway ruling in favor of deep sea mining, which I think has been something that's quite interesting. What is your outlook on deep sea mining, and how, do you think that it could perhaps plug some of this supply gap?
The European Union has taken a pretty clear position on deep seabed mining, which is that we should be very, very cautious before doing it, because so much is unknown about the vulnerability of the environmental and biodiversity ecosystems, many kilometers beneath the sea. And this European position is set out pretty clearly in a variety of documents, including our ocean strategy, our biodiversity strategy, and also in the Critical Raw Materials Act. One of the issues that we negotiated right to the very end was this precise issue. And it's not the place of the Critical Raw Materials Act to address the overarching question of deep seabed mining, yes or no. But what we did write in is we think it's pretty unlikely that there'll be any strategic projects under the Critical Raw Materials Act which are coming from deep seabed mining, because of the unknowns, because of the uncertainties about the potential impact. So we have an extremely cautious approach to this as the European Union. Now, that said, Norway is a sovereign country, and it's for Norway to decide its own policies, as indeed other countries are looking also at the potential of deep seabed mining, including the United States of America, Japan, and China. So there are countries which are looking at this as a potential source of materials to reduce their strategic dependencies. But for the time being, this is not part of the European Union's own plans.
Great. Right. So coming back to the European Union and the Critical Minerals Act, one of the challenges I know that we see, especially in the UK where I'm based, is attracting talent into the mining industry. It seems that the Act has some very ambitious goals to really boost the industry and the sector, but there isn't particularly the same influx of talent and people enrolling into mining-related courses, for instance. So how would you say that the industry needs to attract talent, and should that be a priority?
Yes, whether you're talking about critical raw materials or all of these net zero industry technologies like hydrogen, wind, batteries, they all require different kinds of input. One input is materials, another input is energy, another is capital, and then the other factor of production is people, right? When we're developing all these new technologies and these new value chains, that skills development is definitely a key part of the puzzle. Now, you don't find it explicitly in the Critical Raw Materials Act, but you do find it in the communication which came out with the Act, because there we say that just as we're planning to develop net zero industry academies to develop the skills, the educated people, the workforce for all of those technologies, we're going to do the same thing for raw materials. So we're planning to create a European Raw Materials Academy, which will look at the needs and the gaps from exploration right through mining, refining, recycling, and wherever else we may need them. And it's important also to say that the skills is not just something you need in business, you need it in the public administration as well. So where we've been very ambitious on setting out rules for permitting, we've also said, yes, but member states, you need to make sure you have the right people trained with the right knowledge to do the permitting that we require under the Critical Raw Materials Act. And we as European Commission are ready to provide technical support to help your administrations on request to provide the training for these people. It's not just us. We see that the Americans, the Japanese, and many others, they're facing the same challenge, which is, where do you get the people from to do these things? How do you entice them into this as industries or as professions? But more importantly, how do you make sure that people don't shut off their options already at the age of 14 or 15 by dropping the kind of subjects that you need in order to study, geology, metallurgy, or engineering at university level?
Yeah, it seems like there's going to be a huge bottom-up push needed to develop the workforce, especially given all the targets set. With that in mind, what would be the main priorities, say 2 or 3 priorities that you would identify for the mining industry and mining companies, to set going forward?
Priorities for mining companies. Well, I think if we're talking about mining companies operating in Europe, I think first of all, they need to identify the good projects that they can feed in as candidates for becoming strategic projects under the Critical Raw Materials Act. And that's an offer I make not only for the mining projects, but also for the refining and recycling projects, because we want to move pretty fast on identifying, on receiving and then assessing a first set of strategic projects to get this Critical Raw Materials Act really moving. The second thing that mining companies in particular can do is engage from the very beginning with the local communities to provide reassurance, to provide good explanations and good answers, and they also need to make sure that they're developing the market for their materials, because there's little point developing a good supply side in Europe if you haven't got the demand coming from the downstream manufacturing sector. So we need to get that joined up value chain approach moving much faster than it has done in the past.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Peter. That was a very interesting conversation. I'm sure we could talk about the Critical Raw Materials Act and mining for many hours, but it was great to have you here, and it was great to learn from you. And yeah, thank you everyone for watching. And please do look us up at miningmagazine.com. Thank you very much.